Get myself unmuted. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So happy to have you all here with us on this beautiful Thursday evening. My name is Leslie Jones. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society of Newport County. We're very excited to have you here as we continue our look at the Gilded Age this evening by examining the lives and work of women in the professional arts field. And tonight we are featuring the architect of Julia Morgan. Julia Morgan, as you'll learn from our speaker, Victoria Kastner, was based in California. And it should be said that the West Coast's influence on the Gilded Age and experience of the Gilded Age is of seminal importance, just like the East Coast. It really helps define the American experience. So we're really excited to learn more from Victoria this evening. Before we begin introductions, we hope you plan to join us for our next and last lecture before the spring season ends. That's on Thursday, April 28th, and it will feature 3 prominent scholars and authors who will be discussing the private lives of public women in the Gilded Age. That registration opportunity is already on our website. It will be via Zoom. We hope that you join us for that as well. As a reminder to those of you who are joining us for the first time, or those who are joining us again, we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the program, so please feel free to insert your questions and comments along the way in the Q&A feature here on Zoom, and we'll try and get to as many of those questions as possible. So tonight, our speaker, Victoria Kastner, is a highly respected scholar in her field. She is the author of the first comprehensive biography about America's most renowned female architect, Julia Morgan. And that book title is Julia Morgan, An Intimate Biography of the Trailblazing Architect. Unfortunately, we can't find copies of the book, as we were just discussing. So if you're lucky enough to get that, please do go out and get it. But she has also started work on another book in coordination with the Laguna Art Museum that will be debuting this spring. So please keep your eyes peeled for that. That is, again, also a book on Julia Morgan. And this is a very important year for Julia Morgan. It's her sesquicentennial year. So we're happy to be celebrating her with Kastner this evening, who was the official historian at Hearst Castle for more than 30 years. And during that time, she wrote the definitive trilogy on Hearst Castle's history. Hearst Castle, the biography of a country house, Hearst's San Simeon, the gardens and the land, and Hearst Ranch, family, land, and legacy. You'll probably recognize Victoria from her many speaking opportunities. She's spoken with the Met, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and a variety of other wonderful institutions, as well as appearances on television and film. Victoria has her master's degree in public history with a specialty in architectural history from the University of California at Santa Barbara, as well as a master's degree in museum management from George Washington University. She has also published works on the Beverly Hills Hotel, Bernard Maybeck's Palace of the Fine Arts in San Francisco, and novels of Charles Dickens. So a Renaissance woman, needless to say. So please help us in welcoming Victoria Kastner. Victoria.
Well, that's interesting. For some reason, there we go. All right. Hello, everyone. I had a temporary moment of blackout, but here I am, and I'm so happy to be with you and to share the story of one of the truly unsung women of the Gilded Age, Julia Morgan. She's well known now, but when I first came to Hearst Castle, which was in the late 1970s, and I went on a tour and I fell in love and I decided I had to work there, I was told, a woman built this, but we don't know anything about her. So it has been a pleasure and a privilege to learn about her. And of course, you probably are familiar with her best known estate. It was popularly called Hearst Castle, but William Randolph Hearst called it La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. Or he called it the ranch at San Simeon, because it was and is a working family cattle ranch. Unlike your fabulous Newport houses, which were built at the end of the century, end of the 19th and early 20th century in a matter of years, just a few years, construction on San Simeon proceeded from 1919 to 1947, 28 years. And I think we've been looking at it for a long time as an evocation of the 20th century, which indeed it is. It was the home of a media mogul whose hostess was a movie star, the actress Marion Davies. It was built by a woman, and it was immortalized by a film. Citizen Kane, of course. Orson Welles, not that accurate, but nevertheless incredibly indelible portrait based on the life of William Randolph Hearst. But actually, I think it's important to look back at an earlier time and the last third of the 19th century, because indeed, San Simeon really is the kind of the last breath of an exhausted Gilded Age, if you will, and a seminal example of the country place era. But of course, what's significant about it is that it was built on the wrong side of the country. It wasn't on the East Coast. And instead of the aristocrats and old families, he filled it with the new aristocrats, the aristocrats of our day, authors and movie stars and athletes and people he met through his press. So who was the woman who built this phenomenal structure, which, by the way, was job number 503 of her 700 buildings? And when we consider that she couldn't vote in the presidential election when she began it in 1919, when we got the vote the following year, it's a reminder of how extraordinary her achievements were.
Victoria, I hate to interrupt you. Would you mind stop screen sharing and starting again? There are sort of blackout screens. Try that one more time.
Okay, share screen. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. Shall I go back? I'll quickly. Well, I don't know if I can go back here.
We were able to see most of the images, but the distractions are now gone. So thank you so much.
Okay, there we go. All right. So, and were you able to hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, good. All right. So then here she is again, making a repeat performance, and there's at San Simeon. So there were two long-held myths about Julia Morgan. And one was that she burned her papers when she closed her architectural office in 1950. And the other was that she was a lesbian. My research assistant, Ruth Latson, and I ended up compiling from her correspondence and diaries 800,000 words that she wrote or people wrote to her. And the archive is principally at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo's Robert E. Kennedy Library. So she really did save an amazing amount of material. And I actually think the amount is one of the things that has discouraged thorough scholarship of it. And through looking at all of that and dozens upon dozens of interviews with her family, friends, staff, there's no evidence of her having had a romantic relationship with anyone. In the first third of the 20th century, women, if they had a career, they gave all their time and attention. And when you start to see what Julia Morgan was doing, I don't think you'll have any problem agreeing with me that it appears her primary romance was with architecture all her life. She was very close with her family. She's here with two of her family members, her nephew and niece, in the backyard of a Berkeley home. Anyway, it was so exciting to write this book and have it come out for her sesquicentennial and focus it not on her buildings, but really on her private life. And I was astonished at what I found out, that she was a finer person and she was more heroic and she battled more battles than I'd ever dreamed. And so it was very important to complete this book, which, as Leslie said, is already, the second printing is ordered and will be out in a couple of months, but it's already difficult to find. So I'm glad it's had such a warm reception. And I know one of the reasons for that is my superb photographer, Alexander Verdikoff. Since Julia was a visual artist, it's, I think, very important that we see her work through the eyes of another visual artist. And if you, most of the color images you'll see today are from Alex. And if you go to his website, which is verdikoff.com, he's posted many images of Julia Morgan buildings that he wasn't able, and we weren't able to fit into the book. But just to give you a sample of Alex's beautiful work, this is a staircase at the Berkeley City Club, which was the largest of her dozens of women's clubs. She built this in 1930, and a font from the Columbarium in North Oakland, the Chapel of the Chimes, which she built about 4 years prior to that in the late 1920s. And Alex can make things look three-dimensional even with a normal camera. So you really are going to have a feast for your eyes today. But to tell you about her background, Julia was the second of 5 children and the eldest girl. And she was always a very intense and driven child, never judging anyone else, but always attempting herself to excel, very close to her family and particularly to her mother, Eliza Morgan. And Julia actually had great connections with the East Coast. Eliza's father was a cotton broker, just exactly like Isaac Bell of your great shingle-style Bell House in Newport, and a very successful cotton broker. So Eliza's family was quite wealthy. She married a man whom she met while in high school, named Charles Bill Morgan, also from Brooklyn Heights. And he was not a successful businessman. That little boy you saw in the photograph, Morgan North, later on in life was copiously interviewed. He said about Julia's father, he was into nails, sugar, balloons, farm machinery, voting machines, whatever didn't work, he was in. So a lot of the money to support the Morgans' very well-off lifestyle in California actually came from Eliza's parents. And Julia's maternal grandparents lived in Brooklyn Heights. And so she spent a lot of time on the East Coast. She watched the Brooklyn Bridge be built. She was 13 when it was completed. She spent one entire year there with Eliza and the children. Charles had, things were so bad with Charles's businesses that he temporarily moved into a rooming house and attempted to find work, and they lived on the East Coast. But this was the finest suburb of New York. And the family lived at Remsen Street, 63 Remsen Street. Now, it's not there anymore. The Bossert Hotel has replaced it since 1900, but this is 45 Remsen Street, and it's a back window. So it gives you a sense of these fabulous brownstones with the rich architectural detail. And Julia grew up very, very familiar with the East Coast and visiting frequently. She went to Oakland High School. And when she graduated, she was an accomplished musician. She thought about being a professional musician. She played the violin and the piano. She also was interested in medicine because she always had a scientific mind. But her second cousin, Lucy Latimer, had married an architect of great prominence, Pierre Lebrun. Probably his best known building is the Midlife West insurance tower that's on Madison Avenue in New York City today. So Julia decided to study architecture, and her family were all extremely proud of her and supportive of her. She had one younger sister and one older brother and 2 younger brothers. And this is the house where after Charles, after Albert Parmalee, the cotton broker, after he died, Julia's grandmother moved to California and moved in, and she may well have financed this house in Oakland. It was completed in 1885 when Julia was in her early teens. She lived there for 40 years. So Oakland was, if you will, the Brooklyn Heights of New York. The lots were larger, the weather was better, the transportation was excellent, streetcars that led down to the ferry, and many, many ferry trips per day to get into San Francisco. But you see that rich ornamentation, and I'm sure it looks very familiar to you aficionados of Newport. It's part Eastlake stick. You see the stick framing around the windows, and it's part Queen Anne. There's stained glass windows above the windows at the front entrance, and beautiful tile work and sunburst, etc. She went to the University of California. And this is what it looked like when she enrolled in 1890. It was 4 buildings and an observatory, and in the middle of a large field. And they didn't have an architecture program, actually, but she studied civil engineering while she was there. And of course, there had been a couple of other female civil engineering graduates, but none who did anything professionally after their degree. She graduated in 1894, and it was just after that this man began teaching a great New Yorker, a brilliant and visionary architect, Bernard Maybeck. He was born in Greenwich Village, but he came to California and had tried to set up an office. He was teaching at Cal, teaching applied geometry after Julia graduated. And he was also teaching a drawing at the Mark Hopkins School of Art. And she ended up enrolling there. And that's probably where she met Bernard Maybeck. He was a dreamy sort of man who wore handmade clothes and whom some of his colleagues derided for being a freak. But he was not only a visionary, but an extremely convincing person. And he convinced Phoebe Apperson Hearst, William Randolph Hearst's mother, to completely transform the University of California campus. Phoebe was born in Missouri and in the Ozarks in the 1840s, and which she later called a miserable country. And she married in 1862 a wealthy miner, George Hearst, who had already struck it rich with the Comstock lode, and we're going to be talking about that more in a minute. And so he ended up being this vastly wealthy miner with Anaconda copper mines and Homestead gold mine. And they moved west, and their only child, William Randolph Hearst, was born on April 29th, 1863 in San Francisco. So when George Hearst died as a senator from California in Washington, D.C., Phoebe wanted to commemorate him, and she went to the campus wanting to build a mining building. And they summoned Maybeck, the only architect on the staff. And because he'd gone to the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts in Paris, about which we'll be talking further, he knew that the plan was the important thing, and he convinced her, rather than just fund a building, to fund the redesign of the campus. And she did write a blank check for the first international architectural competition in the world. And so Phoebe transformed the University of California, and Maybeck also designed a building for her. And this is definitely within the realm of your Newport mansions. This is called Wintoon, W-I-N-T-O-O-N. It's a Bavarian castle, as you can see, located on the McCloud River at the base of Mount Shasta in the Oregon, just against the Oregon border in Northern California. And it really does look like it was lifted straight out of the Rhine. So Maybeck designed this dreamscape for Phoebe Apperson Hearst in 1902. It was finished. He also convinced Julia Morgan, whom he met probably at the drawing classes, but then he established an atelier in his own home. He convinced her that she had enough talent to apply to the École des Beaux-Arts, the world's finest school of architecture. And he had graduated from there. So he certainly was an authority. And it would take a lot of temerity for her to apply, because the school had been established in 1648 as kind of a training school for artisans who would later work at Versailles. And they'd never admitted a woman. Now, Maybeck knew that the painting and sculpture departments were on the brink of admitting women. And no, it didn't even occur to anyone that a woman would apply to the architecture department. But he convinced her to travel to Paris, and she left in 1896. And she joined the atelier. That's what you did. You entered a studio. And I think this is important because Newport houses are so influenced by this Beaux-Arts tradition. Of course, the very first American to attend the Beaux-Arts was Richard Morris Hunt, who was there in the 1840s. But from 1890 until 1913, 350 Americans studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, one female. But anyway, this was the Palais des Études, the study hall, if you will. It was full of sculptures in Julia's time. But they had just decided that they would allow women to audit classes. So that was a foot in the door, and she would walk through to audit. But what you did to practice for the arduous examinations was you joined an atelier and took the assignments so that you'd get better at them before you applied. And she joined the atelier of Marcel de Monclos. And this is a little diagram which she drew and sent back to Pierre Lebrun and his wife, Lucy. It says, you see on the right, it says me, that Julia, and then Bud, that's Catherine Budd, who also was a female studying, but certainly didn't graduate. And then it says empty. And you see that long hall, that says men. And also you see the staircase. The women had to walk through the gauntlet of the men's studio in order to get to their little cubicles at the back. And Julia wrote to the Lebruns, one man is very gentlemanly, but the others could be exchanged with no difficulty. So there's no doubt she was hazed. That was a tradition in the école. It was, she had water poured over her head. She was pushed off the ends of buildings. People refused to help her with her projects, which was the natural thing that the younger students did to assist the older students. She stood it all, and she spent a lot of time drawing because that was an exceptionally important part of the curriculum at the École des Beaux-Arts. This is the Hôtel de Ville. This is a ceiling ornament in Paris, and you see it's September of 1896. She'd only been there since June when she drew that. Drawing was part of it. Touring around Paris was part of it. She loved Notre Dame, and she hated to be photographed. So it's quite rare, but we do have this picture of her outside Notre Dame. Her favorite thing was the gargoyles. And she wrote home that they were half wicked, half fiend gargoyles. And she liked to peer above them and look over and see the city of Paris and imagine it as they had seen it, as it grew through the centuries. So she was completely entranced by Paris, and it was the right time to be there. It was the Belle Époque, and there were more Americans studying at the École des Beaux-Arts than at any other time. She did do a bit of traveling, especially after her brother, younger brother Avery, with whom she was very close. He came to Paris in 1898 and lived with her for the next couple of years. This is a farmhouse near Provins that she sketched during some of her travels. And she was doing the assignments. Now, the way the école worked was you didn't get grades. You went to classes, but you advanced through the program by doing these elaborate drawings. You'd be given an assignment, and then you'd be shut in a room for 12 hours, and you had to come up with a mock-up. And then you went home, you went back, and 6 weeks later, you have these elaborate drawings in plan, section, and elevation. And you can see by looking at them how much the architecture of Newport was, and all the great civic buildings of the late 19th and early 20th century in America was influenced by the curriculum of the Beaux-Arts. The idea was that you took the past and improved on it by using historic precedent, but not in a slavishly accurate way. You mix things together. She applied and didn't pass the test the first time. That was very typical for most Americans. But she did very well. She scored 42nd out of 400 candidates. The second time she applied, she got a worse score, and she didn't understand why. And when she met her mentor, de Monclos, she asked what was wrong. He said the score. And then he said that the judges at the école had decided, we don't want to encourage young girls. So they had deliberately lowered her score. And I don't think they would have done that if she weren't going to pass, you know? So the great book by Jean-Paul Carlian and Margot Ellis about Americans in Paris, it lists everyone at the école. Julia was able to get her certificat, her certificate. And it was on the strength of these final drawings. She got admitted in 1898. And then she had this arduous program. This was her last prize-winning drawing. All students had to leave the école when they turned 30. And she was days away from turning 30 when she had this assignment to design a theater in a palace. That's the 12-hour sketch. This is the final finished drawing. And but because she was not able to do the final year, which was a full apprenticeship in an architect's office, she's not listed among the graduates who had earned the diplôme. And I think she certainly would have been if she hadn't had to lose an entire year before they finally were shamed into admitting her. But it's a good sign of how remarkable a person she was, what pertinacity she had throughout her life. And it was a worldwide event. And to her great dismay, she found when she did get the certificate, the next certificate of completion of the program, it made worldwide press. The Jackson, Mississippi Courier said her blockhouses in childhood had been amazing. The Pall Mall Gazette in London said that, of course, she wouldn't be working in the field. She'd simply be in offices. But then they said something very accurate. They said, Miss Morgan is dismayed by the amount of attention she has received. And that was certainly true. First, we're breaking this barrier and getting admitted in 1898, and then getting this certificate in 1902, after which she went back to Berkeley, which had changed very much in the 6 years she'd been away because of the Apperson Hearst. And one of her first projects was she started working in the office of the campus architect named John Galen Howard. He'd been given the commission after the prize-winning Frenchman, Émile Besnard, had taken the prize money and left. He didn't like Californians, and it was mutual. So John Galen Howard, another man from the East Coast, he ended up being the architect. Now, this wasn't in the original plan, but it was added, and of course, it's a Greek theater. And Julia was not the designer, but she was the construction superintendent and working 24 hours a day. This is steel reinforced concrete to get this magnificent building finished by deadline. It may be where she met William Randolph Hearst. We don't know, but Greek theater was his donation. His mother had, funded so many things on the campus, including the entire Hearst Memorial Mining Building. And he was just wanting to give a gift. He either met her there at the grand opening, or he met her here at his mother's estate, another great house of the Gilded Age. But, in California, we have the different milieu, the Spanish and the Native American styles. That all began when A. Page Brown built his Mission Revival, as it came to be called, California building at the 1893 World's Fair, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And that really started this whole movement where the Westerners looked at the buildings around them and decided to emulate them. So this was going to be William Randolph Hearst's own house, the Hacienda. It was on a horse ranch in Pleasanton, and he asked Phoebe for permission to build there. She said, yes, as long as you don't do anything very large. And then she came out for an inspection tour and was appalled to see this enormous 50-plus room structure going up. So she confiscated it. She made it her own home. And she kept on the architect, whose name was Albert Cicero Schweinfurth. But sadly, he died of pneumonia very young in 1900. And by 1903, Phoebe had hired Julia Morgan to complete the building, add on to which she worked on it on and off until 1915. So we don't know where W.R. and Julia met, but it was certainly through the auspices of his mother. And it was at one or the other of those places. One of Julia's first commissions ended up really being a hallmark of her great skill. It was El Campanile at the Mills College for Women in Oakland. She may have known the founders through her family, who were well connected in Oakland, or it may have been from an introduction by Phoebe Epperson Hearst. We don't really know. But this is the steel reinforced building, concrete building, and built in 1902, when this Mission Revival style was the equivalent of a rocket ship compared to the Italianate Victorian architecture like you saw at Julia's own home. So she started it in 1902 and finished it in 1904. And when 2 years later, it survived the 1906 earthquake without a single crack in it, a 72-foot high tower, her reputation was assured. And she had moved into San Francisco and was working in John Galen Howard's office. And then in 1904, she made history again by becoming the first female architect ever certified in California. And then came the earthquake on April 18th, 1906. It was a 7.9 on the Richter scale. There have been few more devastating quakes in the history of, recorded history in North America. $500 million of damage to buildings, and of course, loss of hundreds of lives, perhaps as many as 500. We're not sure. It's hard to tell with the Chinese population, which hadn't been counted. It could have been in the low thousands. It was a tremendous tragedy. And for Julia Morgan, it was a personal tragedy as well, because she had moved out of John Galen Howard's office and into her own in the same building on Montgomery Street in San Francisco, only to see it exploded. And that's what you see here. They, in an effort to stop the fires which raged through the city for the next 48 hours after the gas mains had exploded and all the wires had come down and all, and there was no water to fight them because the water mains had broken. So they tried to create a fire break by dynamiting the buildings around the financial district, including Julia's office. She lost all her papers, personal drawings and things. It's remarkable. I mean, thank goodness she wrote so much to Pierre and Lucy in New York. And so we do have a record, but there would have been a great deal more. It was exploded by the quake. One of the last buildings to go up in flames was one of the newest buildings in San Francisco, the Fairmont Hotel. And this is where we start to get an intersection between California and Julia Morgan and Newport, Rhode Island. The Fairmont was this shining white hostelry, this brand new modern hotel. It was just had opened days before. And it resisted the fire for a long time, but then a breeze, blew the sparks in. And as you can see, it was a gutted shell. The history of the Fairmont, and the reason it has that name Fair in it, is the history of James Graham Fair's two daughters. Now, he was a miner, and he struck it rich in the Comstock lode in the 1870s. It was such a rich vein of silver that after George Hearst, there were many, many more fortunes made, So he had two daughters, Virginia, or as she was known, Bertie, who married William K. Vanderbilt II, and built the fair stables, became eminent at raising thoroughbred horses, and her sister, Teresa, or Tessie, who of course married Herman Ulrichs, and she's the one who is really involved with the story. James Fair had in 1894 bought a large plot of land on Nob Hill where the Crocker and the Stanfords and all these people were building great mansions, the Floods. And the girls said, for heaven's sakes, we don't need a mansion, we need a hotel. And after their father died, we need a decent place to stay, you know. And after he died, they commissioned James and Merritt Reed were the architects to build the Fairmont Hotel. And then, of course, you know that Tessie also, she bought the land from George Bancroft, whose Rose Cliff was named on Bellevue Avenue for the beautiful collection of roses that he had raised. But she commissioned Stanford White, when she was Mrs. Herman Ulrichs, you know, to build the Rose Cliff that we know today. Now, when the brand new Fairmont Hotel was ruined, Stanford White was also commissioned to re-engineer and restore it. But as many of you know, sadly, in 1906, he was shot. And it was called the crime of the century. This Harry K. Thaw, crazed husband of Evelyn Nesbit, whose character and reputation White had besmirched by having a relationship with. So he was killed in Madison Square Garden, the original one. And so then the commission went Julia. And I think it was on, we don't know exactly all the dynamics of it, but I think it was on the reputation that she had established with that fabulous high concrete tower, not even having a crack. She began working almost immediately after, you know, in the summer of 1906. And the foundations of the Fairmont had moved 7 feet. People didn't think it could even be restored. She worked at night in a small shack. And you see the shack that's right almost in the direct middle of this photograph. I wonder if it wasn't that. It certainly looks, with that little place beside it, certainly looks like a construction shack. She later said that rats jumped over her feet while she worked at night on the calculations until she could stabilize the building sufficiently that she could move in and then continue to oversee its re-engineering and rebuilding. And another connection to, this is Rose Cliff that Stanford White designed for the Ulrichs, and it's another connection between it and the Fairmont. It was finished in 1902, but though it looks like it's white marble, it's actually faced with a glazed terracotta that resembles white marble. And that's true of the Fairmont as well. And here it is in all its glory. Julia not only re-engineered and did the impossible, but she did it under budget and on time. It opened on the anniversary of the quake in 1907, the first major building to be restored in all of ravaged San Francisco. So she was already known, you know, as really an outstanding architect when she established her office in the Merchants Exchange building, which was in the financial district. And for a couple of years, she took a partner because there was so much work for architects after the quake. His name was Ira Wilson Hoover. He actually lived in the house that they built on the right here with that beautiful wood carved oriel window on the ground floor. The one on the left that she and Hoover both designed, Julia later sold this for $1. So really, in effect, gave it to one of her long-term employees, Thaddeus Joy. But this is typical of what they call the First Bay tradition, these rustic, woodsy, shingle-style houses that were going up all over Berkeley, especially in the years after the earthquake. And here is something that's very typical on the inside. Now, the arts and crafts in California had a different approach, both in Northern and Southern California. In Northern California, the focus was really on the setting as much as on the client and the landscape. And they always figured heavily into the designs. But here you see, this is now the Cassidy House. It was commissioned by Louise Goddard after the earthquake in 1908. But you see the beautiful detail on a kind of a classic arts and crafts interior that Julia designed. One of the largest arts and crafts compounds in America, Julia also designed, and it's called Asilomar. She built more than a dozen buildings there. It means refuge by the sea, and it was built for the YWCA. And the YWCA was an incredibly important social movement in the first, say, 40 years of the 20th century. Young girls were leaving their family farms to come to cities They were becoming stenographers and teachers. They were learning to work, but they couldn't live in a boarding house filled with itinerant traveling salesmen. So the YWCAs provided a safe place for girls to live. And Julia designed literally dozens of YWCAs, the easternmost of which is in Salt Lake City. But in order for the girl, and Phoebe Hearst was very involved in this whole movement, in order for the girls to have a place to go in the summertime, a place for a vacation, C. Lamar was born. Now, this is the Grace Dodge Chapel, which Julia designed in 1915. Here's Alex's beautiful photograph of its interior. So you see the rustic woodsiness. In the beginning, this chapel, that altar was at the far end. Then later on, they built a much larger auditorium as well. But it was definitely the case that the focus of this entire compound was the view. It was built right on the ocean, south of Monterey in Pacific Grove. And so there you see at the altar level, a window. And all this time, he was also working with William Randolph Hearst. He asked her to design a massive house after the contretemps with his mother at the hacienda. And she did. She designed a huge country home for him in Sausalito, but he didn't have the money to build it. And then she designed a bungalow for him on the south rim of the Grand Canyon in 1908. And then she designed this massive building. And there was nothing in between, so from a tiny little bungalow to this 100,000 square foot Los Angeles Examiner building, which she designed 1913, 1914, in that Mission Revival style we've been discussing, with a newspaper printing plant and lavish offices. And it's just gone through a magnificent restoration. It's got a new life and a new role as a place for students at Arizona State University. So they knew one another well, and she knew that he was a client who was amazingly involved in every small decision. And in 1919, when Phoebe Hearst died of the influenza epidemic, which of course has been much on our minds in these last few years, then W.R. at the age of 56 inherited her vast estate. Now, he had 28 newspapers, 14 magazines, 8 radio stations, 2 film companies. He'd been a financial success since he was given the San Francisco Examiner at age 24 in 1887. But of course, this meant that he owned San Simeon, the land which his father had bought when W.R. was only 2. And one big difference that I was thinking about between the Newport mansions and San Simeon is not only that, this protracted length of construction, 28 years, but also a law. In 1909, the American Congress passed the Payne-Aldrich Tariff. And it said that if you could prove that something was a work of art and more than 100 years of age, you did not have to pay duty on it. Now, J.P. Morgan was really one of the people who lobbied hardest for this, because before that, the duty prices had just been prohibitively expensive. Sadly, he didn't get to benefit from it much because he died in 1913, but especially in the years after the First World War ended, beginning as in 1919, art began to pour out of Europe and into American auction houses and art galleries. And so rather than just have craftsmen build in a style or recreate in plaster, W.R. was buying actual pieces by the tens of thousands, quite frankly, and Julia's job was to incorporate them into this and many, many other buildings. So he walked into her office and said he was tired of camping and thinking of building a little something on the hill that was more permanent than the tents he'd been staying in at San Simeon. And she consented. And with that, she really became the architect royal who worked on so many major projects. We have their letters. This is part of this extraordinary trove. And our goal, my assistant Ruth Latson is currently proofreading, but we are going to take that 800,000 words and give it to Cal Poly's the Kennedy Library, they've said that they will post it. So it's going to be possible to study Julia Morgan wherever you are, anywhere in the world. But these letters that she exchanged with Hearst number 2,462, if you add in the letters and telegrams. So it's an extraordinary archive and record. And in one of the early ones, he wrote to her, the main thing at the ranch is the view. And there you see it. They started with what they called the cottages. And of course, that's another affinity with you at Newport. These were bungalows, and they're not excessively large, but they are between 10 and 20 rooms. What you see here is a scheme of the hilltop with the main building, which he called Casa Grande, the big house. in the center, like a church in a hill city. And then these 3 cottages around the sides. And the writing here, this is Julia's writing at the bottom, and she's asking him about what does he think of them. And he's writing on the side, and he says, well, I like the idea of these 3 cottages, but I think that the one on the right has an archway that I like very much, and it should be transferred to the one that's in the center. That was House C, or Casa del Sol. So she did. And she was involved in an extraordinary degree to with every aspect of this protracted construction, which was all steel reinforced concrete. And here it is, Casa del Sol. So they started with these 3 cottages, which are named for the views of the mountains, Casa del Monte, Casa del Sol, and of the sea, Casa del Mar. And it was very modern. And this is similar to Newport as well. Of course, they generated their own electricity. They had the wiring underground. You had a phone system put in by the mid-1920s. But of course, the feeling is this rich, recreation of a past that never was, the past of a dream. So they started with the 3 cottages, and here you see Julia at work. She was wearing what she usually wore. Now, WR was 56 when he started, and she was 47. And as I told you, couldn't yet vote for in a presidential election. She wore these long wool suits and beautiful white blouses. It's a hot day, so she's rolled up her sleeves here and taken off her hat, which she usually wore, a cloche style Queen Mary hat. There was a pleated skirt, and these actually evolved from the Parisian walking suit of the late 1890s, which was a big fashion inspired by women's equestrian riding habits. And it was the perfect sort of outfit for someone who, like Julia Morgan, was, always climbing scaffolds. She just put on a pair of men's trousers and climbed away. She was involved in every small aspect of the design. And from one bungalow, which is what WR said he wanted to build in the beginning in April of 1919, one of her employees said within a month they were going on the grand scale. Well, that was clearly the scale at which W.R. Hearst operated. And with this fortune now, at last, he could build on his favorite site, San Simeon. And the inspiration for the towers was a specific cathedral, Santa Maria la Mayor in Andalusia. He was not a religious person, but as I said, it's meant to look like a hill city. This is 1922. They broke ground in February of 1920. So you can see the construction was quite rapid. All of the drawings. Now, Julia has, of course, a staff of depending, 6 to 10 draftsmen and draftswomen in her San Francisco office, Julia Morgan Architect, it was called. But every drawing that went out under her purview. Unlike many architects, she didn't delegate to, some of her subordinates who then dealt directly with clients. And that could lead to some awkward moments. One of her female draftswomen, Dorothy Wormser Koblenz, said that she was designing a breakfast nook and she'd never seen the client because Julia always met with him off site. And it turned out he was a very corpulent man who couldn't possibly have fitted into it. but Julia was committed to the privacy of her clients. And as I say, hers was just one of many, even though she really worked with him pretty much her entire career. Mark Allen Hewitt, who wrote the book, The Architect and the American Country House, said, many people would look at this style of architecture and see it as a mishmash. And of course, in the 70s and 1980s, people certainly did. He said Julia Morgan would not have seen it that way. To blend together historic objects and then recreate objects to provide the setting for them was in itself a creative act. And here you see the front of Casa Grande. The antique peak portions are just around the front door. Some wild men wood roses that are Gothic stone carving, a Virgin Mary under that canopy right at the top. But most of this is steel reinforced concrete. And like some of your Newport buildings, it's faced like the Breakers, I believe, with a veneer of limestone, but in this case from Manti, Utah. So it's scored to look as if it's all brick, but it's all steel reinforced concrete. The wood idea came from an alero, a kind of Spanish hood that was usually over a doorway. And Hearst had seen this in a publication in Barcelona. And so they're going back and forth constantly with these letters. And the difficulty was keeping the scale together. But her training at the Beaux-Arts was very handy. She always worked from the inside out. She always focused on the plan. There's a central axis which goes straight from the west through the front door all the way back to the east. And then there's a secondary, tertiary axis, you know, like in a church, there'd be an aisle and then the crossing. But she was, and you see that upstairs, all of the rooms have windows. You went outside to see the view, which was always so important, because inside you had the collections of WR. He was a hands-on collector, unlike someone like J.P. Morgan or Henry Clay Frick. He wasn't deferring to dealers, and he wasn't only buying the best. He was buying sometimes the best and sometimes what he liked the best. And only 5% of what he owned was in his collection prior to 1920, as far as the things that went to San Simeon. So for Julia Morgan, that means that she's dealing with objects that are constantly arriving, and they're never the right size for where they're going to go. So this is the refectory where they ate, and the ceiling is actually Italian Renaissance panels that once ran along a wall, and she mounted them as a ceiling. Of course, there's a bearing I-beam ceiling above this, and it's bolted, but she also had to extend it. The fireplace that they used was a part of a fragment of a monastery in Marcillac, France, that WR had bought from the German art dealer Raoul Heilbronner, but it was only 11 feet high. So they added on all of this concrete and put ornaments in it. The choir stalls, which are these dark wood panels around the room, they weren't the right size either. They all came from one church, Seu de Urgel in Catalonia, in Spain. And, you know, it was the perfect time to be buying. As I said, art was flooding into America in the years after the First World War. And also British fortunes were being decimated by these confiscatory inheritance taxes. So WR did go to Europe a lot, but not particularly to buy. Most of his buying he did in New York. And he did have really world-renowned collections. And one of them was his collection of Greek vases, which is here. He actually had almost 400 at San Simeon. And they're all, you know, from the ancient Greece. And they were all affixed up there so that in the event of an earthquake, they wouldn't tumble down. The ceiling is Spanish, and from the 16th century, it was in portions, and again, Julia reassembled it. But the lights were electric, and the ambiance was comfort, and this is one of two libraries in the main building. WR had his own as well upstairs. And she's the interior designer. There was no interior designer. She's the landscape architect. And here she's done a drawing where you can see two figures who look very much like Julia Morgan and William Randolph Hearst, except she gave herself a couple inches since she was tall, 6'3". In the gardens, it says suggestions for feature opposite entrance of House B. That was the House of the Mountains. So she's overseeing the creation of these lavish grounds, which extend almost 120 acres. And you can see in the distance, this is a view WR owned, what the hills looked like when they began, and how extraordinarily remote this was. The way she did it was she would work a full week and a half day on Saturday, and then she would take the ferry from San Francisco to Oakland. Then she'd catch the train, because Oakland was the end of the Transcontinental Railroad. So she'd take the train all night, and she'd arrive in San Luis Obispo, which is 45 miles south of San Simeon, and in those days, at least a 2-hour trip. She'd get there before dawn, have breakfast, and then be driven up and spend the whole day with the craftsman and WR if he were there. And then she'd do it all in reverse. And we know this because one of her employees went along once, and he said, so Monday morning we get back into San Francisco and I'm exhausted. She hasn't spent the night anywhere except on the train. He said, I'm ready to go to bed. And she walked right into the office, went back to work. She made 568 separate trips to San Simeon. So generally, that was 1 to 2 times a month, as well as this constant correspondence. And history is very fortunate that WR didn't live there all the time, and that she didn't live there, so that we do have that peerless record. The whole estate is tied together by this esplanade, this walkway, which is like a ribbon, which connects the cottages with the main building. And you see the lantana here cascading over the sides of that retaining wall in a teardrop shape. So gardens were extremely important. He had more than 1,000 roses. Nothing grew up here but oak trees, and those they never cut. They actually moved 4 200-year-old oak trees. You see the branches of one here on the left. And that meant digging an entire basin around these enormous trees and moving them, and they didn't lose a one. but he would never cut a tree down, and he would move them out of the way so that he could site the buildings or plan the view more effectively. But speaking of effective, the most astonishing things about Julia Morgan's landscape designs are her swimming pools. And we don't know if she ever even knew how to swim, but she knew how to take water and a utilitarian feature like the swimming pool and make a spectacular architectural fantasy out of it. This is the Roman plunge, as it was called, because it was all one depth, 10 feet, except for that back where there's an alcove where it's a meter deep. There are stairs that are hidden behind the walls that go up to that diving platform. And it's part Ravenna, 15th century. It was 5th century, sorry. It was based on a mausoleum called Gala Placidia, these mosaics. And the tile, which are glass and 1 inch square, many of them are 22 karat gold sandwiched into clear glass. They came from Murano, the glass island, making island off the coast of Venice. But it's also Hollywood Art Deco. You can see that on the platform, the mermaids diving in gilded tile, or these little nymphs on, piloting boats. And it's just the most delightful fantasy. Beautiful by day, unforgettable by night when the globes are like moons on the water, and not just one pool, but two. He designed the Neptune pool, and this was done over 14 years in 3 different versions. Its namesake is the figure of Neptune at the top of the temple with 2 sea nymphs beside him. Those are 17th century statues Hearst bought from French & Company, an art dealer in New York City. He bought the columns, the 6 columns in the temple, from the San Giorgio galleries of Rome. And if you look, you see they're not the same height or width. They're fragments, of many buildings, and she's put them together. It's just a facade. And then, there's no way to get into that temple. But the basin itself, this magnificent blue water, it's 104 feet long. It's 96 feet wide. It held 345,000 gallons of water that came from mountain springs to the east by gravity to the hilltop. They never finished it because you see this open area in the foreground of the photograph. He was planning to put an immense statue of Neptune up there. There's no access to it, but that didn't get finished. And as I said, these pools have a day aspect and a night aspect. And the great architectural critic and architect, Charles Moore, called the Neptune pool a grand liquid ballroom for the gods and goddesses of the silver screen, because indeed Carol Lombard and Cary Grant and Harpo Marx and Charlie Chaplin and Jean Harlow, were there a lot. They were the friends of the woman with whom Hearst lived for so long, Marion Davies, herself a film actress. She designed not only the top of the hill, but all of the attendant buildings, including in the estate village. She designed this Mission Revival warehouse where they would keep material, and then 3 metal warehouses are behind it. She designed an entire village for the Hearst employees, which is still the home of many Hearst Ranch employees today. And of course, every grand house had its estate village, but they're gone. They've been subdivided and repurposed, but not San Simeon. It's still in its original function. And she's also designing the largest zoo in America, because Hearst is a great animal lover. She's feeding Mary Ann the elephant here. And so she was just unflappable. Whatever, she's getting a telegram, "Dear Miss Morgan, we need Icelandic moss for the reindeer to eat." Temporarily quartering them on the tennis courts. It was like, another world, especially when you consider it was happening in the 1920s and 30s. And at the same time, while San Simeon looks on the ocean from a very high distance, like your Newport houses, Marion Davies had a house literally on the beach, and it was called the Beach House. And they started building it in 1927. This near building you see was actually not by Julia. It was by an architect named William Flannery. But Julia did design the swimming pool with its Venetian marble bridge. And she did design the distant building there, which is a cottage. Those were the 2 buildings which survived the terrible Northridge earthquake in 1994, whereas the Beach House, built by another individual, fell completely to the ground. It was rebuilt, but not in the original style, not in the Georgian style. But this was where Marion would, entertain her friends, and she was a beloved member of the film colony. And she would pay for the cook's daughters to go to college. She'd make a fund for the actors who failed their sound tests and couldn't get any more parts. She was just an absolutely warm-hearted and delightful woman. W.R.'s wife, Millicent, for whom he bought Alva Vanderbilt, house, St. Joan, on the Gold Coast of Sands Point, Long Island, and then he remodeled it. She lived on the East Coast. She was a Catholic. She was divorce was unthinkable. He lived on the West Coast with Marion Davies, and really they had a kind of a court, if you will, their own little Versailles, where people went between the beach house and San Simeon. So you see what a beautiful neoclassical cottage this is in terms of scale, but it has its Hollywood moments with these fabulous tiles, which Alex photographed in the Hollywood style bathrooms. So this is work she's doing all in the late 1920s, and yet working on all these other projects. I showed you that font at the beginning. It was the Chapel of the Chimes, this beautiful columbarium, which she designed in the north of Oakland. And here's the corridor. It's all cast stone, but it gives the feeling of late Romanesque, early Gothic. And that's because W.R. had just purchased a Spanish monastery in 1926. He ended up buying two, and he paid to have them dismantled, the ornamental portions numbered, shipped to America. And though Julia didn't go, she was very involved in corresponding with the man who was in charge, this American architect and art dealer named Arthur Bine in Spain. And so the buildings that she was designing in the late 20s really reflected the same architectural style as these beautiful monasteries. And that includes the largest of her city clubs. This is where I showed you the staircase at the beginning. This Berkeley City Club. It was 46,000 square feet and 6 stories. And it was meant to be the clearinghouse for women's clubs throughout the East Bay. For the young girls, there was the YWCA. But for older women, the way that they networked was through women's clubs. Tremendously important, not just for civic beautification and education, but also for their own social development. And Julia designed everything about the city club, the book plate, the china, and these massive beams, which look like carved wood, are carefully textured to do so, are concrete. They're structural beams. This is the lounge. And she's designing even the lamp, the chandeliers here. Made in a simple way so that artisans from the time could create them. And here's the full shot, Alex's full shot of the spectacular swimming pool at the Berkeley City Club, which is on the cover of our book. And you see what a propensity she had with swimming pools. She designed 36 of them, but I think these 3 are her most beautiful: the Neptune pool, the Roman pool, and this pool at the City Club, which, by the way, is on the first story of this 6-story high concrete building. And so this had to be engineered to hold the weight of all of those upper floors. Now, she didn't engineer this building. She worked closely with those who did, but because of her technical knowledge in construction and her deep understanding of civil engineering, that really made a huge difference in her design and in the employing of steel reinforced concrete, which she so frequently used in an earthquake prone state like California. But in terms of programmatic architecture and things that maybe match Newport in their sheer fantasy aspect, the wind tune I showed you, Phoebe's wind tune, burned to the ground. And in 1930, W.R. asked Julia to redesign it. And she built a compound at Wind Tune. This is only one portion of 3 areas of buildings, but it is spectacular, this Bavarian village right out of a fairy tale. And this is Cinderella House, and you can see her rushing down the staircase with the prince in hot pursuit. And you see the clock at 5 minutes, permanent 5 minutes to midnight. These wonderful murals were done by a Hungarian illustrator who also worked on another great American house, Kadazan, in Sarasota, the home of John and Mabel Ringling. But his name was Willie Pogany, and he was a children's book illustrator. And here you see them at the ball celebrating. And W.R. and Marion lived here in what was called Brown Bear House. And it's another Brothers Grimm fairy tale, not as well known, about a man who's turned into a bear and goes away. He's betrothed to this woman, most unwillingly on her part. He goes away and comes back a young man, handsome, young and rich, and marries her at last. These cottages straight out of Bavaria have this front entrance on a village green with these towering trees, but they overhang on their other side the rushing McCloud River. So really completely, there you see him. He's doffing his bear suit and just above the door and letting her know that it's okay, you know. And I think it's poignant. Maybe W.R. was hoping he could be that bear who became a beautiful young man, because he did very much want to marry Marion Davies and was never able to. But they did live together in this fantasy cottage. So Julia's designing this. I told you it's on the northern edge of California. You couldn't find two more far-flung places, and she's building some of the largest homes in the United States simultaneously with running this whole architecture firm. It was too much. You'd see her face twisted here. She ended up having numerous inner ear operations and after terrible infections, and finally her whole inner ear was removed, robbing her of her equilibrium and disfiguring her face. And one of the employees at Wintune said most of us would throw ourselves into the ocean, but she just persevered, even though she fell into things and people mistook her for being drunk. She would still climb scaffolds. She would just ask someone she knew well to walk right in front of her, and she put her finger in his coat pocket so that he wouldn't fall. One of the buildings that she did in those post years, in the late 30s, was redo the beautiful entrance for the Hearst building in San Francisco on 3rd and Market. But Hearst wasn't being much of a client because he was having money troubles. Though when he died in 1951, he had a huge estate of $120 million, but he was $87 million in debt by the late 30s from overspending, from not acknowledging the depression, from not letting anyone off, you know. So Julia began to travel because, as her family said, she only traveled when she couldn't build. The great project that she wanted to build with WR never came about. They were going to take the stones of the second monastery that he purchased in Spain, Santa Maria de Ovila. They called it Mount Olive, and they were going to create in Golden Gate Park a medieval museum using, you know, of concrete, but using these beautiful limestone carved stones as its exterior. And unlike the cloisters, the beautiful John D. Rockefeller's Cloisters Museum at Fort Tryon Park in New York, that's the mixture of many fragments of many buildings. This was all going to be from one single monastery. WR gave it to the city of San Francisco, but the Board of Supervisors reallocated the money. Julia tried for 10 years to have this work completed, and sadly it never was. It would have definitely been one of her very greatest projects. There were fires set around the wooden crates which burned, and then the markings burned off the stones, which were scavenged and put in many different places, and some still remain in Golden Gate Park. A medieval order of Cistercians in Northern California and Vina actually recreated recently the chapter house. So there is a portion of that monastery where the stones have been employed, but it was a huge, might have been of her final years. In her final years, and you see her here looking away, thinking, why are you taking this photograph? She always hated to be photographed. In her final years, she sadly was beset by the same dementia, which had been a huge problem within her family, especially for her younger brother, Avery, with whom she was so close. He spent many, many years of his adult life institutionalized with Julia caring for him. And finally, in 1943, wandered away from the care home and was found only 9 months later, dead from starvation and exposure. So she was always doing a great deal for all the members of her family, all the time that she was doing all of this work. Leaning over her is Flora North, who was the wife of Morgan North, her nephew, who Flora donated Julia's papers to Cal Poly, and Morgan is responsible for many of these reminiscences. And the woman smiling at her is Sachi Oka, who Julia built a little house for a studio for herself and a little house, a cottage in Monterey when her health got so precarious that she needed to rest. And Sachi started as her housekeeper and became her devoted friend. And she bought a brand new car for Sachi when Sachi and her husband were interned in post in Arizona during the Second World War. She sent them things they needed. And then when they got out, she bought them a house very near her own in Monterey. So she was a woman of incredible generosity who really didn't put much energy into what other people thought. She thought that architecture was an art of form, not an art of words. But one of the reasons she was nearly forgotten is that she didn't give interviews, and she didn't publish her work in magazines, and she didn't teach. She just wanted to be an architect. But when WR died in 1951, and he had wished that La Cuesta Encantada would go to the University of California, they turned it down as prohibitively expensive, and so it became a state park. But he'd always built it with the notion that it would become a museum, and of course, so it indeed has. Julia died at 85 in 1957, and that's just about the time when it was set to open. But sadly, her dementia had really reduced her capabilities in those final years, and it was a very tough ending because she knew about her fading powers. So very, very difficult time. When she died at 85 in 1957, just a couple months later, Life magazine did a cover story on San Simeon because it was just about to open with the Neptune pool on the cover. And with 14 pages of text and photos, Julia's name was never mentioned. And in 1966, when Joan Didion did an essay called Return to Xanadu, which was about nothing but the architectural impact of San Simeon, Julia's name was never mentioned. So I know that there were many women like that in the Gilded Age. Here you see her, and one of the accolades which she did permit, and that was to get an honorary doctorate from her alma mater, the University of California in 1929. It's a pleasure to be able to tell more of the story of this brilliant woman from the Gilded Age. And I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.